you. Thank you so much. All right, thank you everybody for joining today. I'm also a board member of Celebrate Water, hence the t-shirt. So it's great to see so many people turn up for this, our first ever event. So it's really great to have everybody here. Now, as was mentioned, I do lead in sustainability. I am originally from Door County, and I am basically the proverbial fish out of water in this event in that I am not speaking just about water and I am not a scientist. My background is actually in architecture. I graduated from Milwaukee and have since left Wisconsin and worked in areas like Hong Kong, Thailand, Singapore, etc. But I'm actually going to be focusing on the topic of tourism and hospitality. And I was asked to do so primarily because our entire economy in Door County is really founded on this premise of tourism. So like I said, what we're going to be doing is what does sustainability have to do with tourism and hospitality, as well as the future of sustainability in tourism and hospitality. And it sounds a little mundane, but I have to preface this actually by saying that this is a really big topic, and it's one that I didn't even know existed. I mean, having come from Door County, obviously, I've worked in tourism since the age of 14. I've been a dishwasher, I've been a toilet cleaner, I've been, a hostess, I've been a waitress, I've been all these different positions within this great county of ours, but I never thought of it as an actual industry. When you're that age, it's usually just like a summer job that you have. Well, when we talk about tourism and hospitality and sustainability, it actually turns out to be quite a huge issue. And I've led 2 workshops on this for the Door County Visitor Bureau, and both of them were 3 hours long. So what we're really going to talk about today is just scratching the surface on some of the issues regarding this as an industry. Now, basically, as you've been hearing in the earlier presentations today, there are a lot of environmental issues that our world is facing today, right? When we're talking about things like climate change, or it could be microplastics, or just plastic pollution. It could be deforestation, or it could even be wildlife and biodiversity loss. The fact that 12 million people die each year because air pollution issues, or wastewater sewage problems. None of these are pretty, but they happen each and every day. I can't even open up my news app on my phone anymore without one of these becoming the headline topic. So the question often comes, what does tourism and hospitality have to do with it? Now, the reality of the situation is that when we look at tourism and hospitality, it is mega huge. As an industry globally, it contributes 1 in 10 jobs around the world. And it also contributes to 10% of the world's GDP. So economically speaking, it's a massive, massive industry. And this is the same for the United States. So travel and tourism, or TNT, actually in 2017 with domestic and international travelers, spent more than $1 trillion in the United States alone. If you want to break that down and crunch the numbers a little bit more, you can start to see that that equals about $2.8 billion a day that is spent in this industry. A massive $118.2 million an hour. So that's how much will be spent by the time that you leave this discussion today. $2 million a minute and $32,840 every single second. On top of that is also America's largest employer. It supported 15.6 million jobs, and 8.8 million of those are directly employed. And it is the United States' 7th largest employer. So it's not only big and important for Door County, it's big and important for the nation. So we have a really strong idea of what the economic impact of this industry is. I don't know if many of you have seen, but just about, I think, maybe 3 issues ago, the Peninsula Pulse had a segment on the economic impact of tourism in Door County. Tons of numbers, right? Yeah. So we all know how important it is economically to Door County. But what about in terms of things like environmental impact as well as social impact outside of job creation? So do we ever question that? Now, the reason that we don't necessarily know and can't quickly come up with an answer is because there's this general idea that global perception is that tourism is an industry based not on a necessity, but rather on the unessential. Because think about it, like as an American, we're the worst at taking vacations. Maximum, you're lucky if you take like 1 week to 2 weeks a year. So when you look at your own life and look at those 365 days that are afforded to you, 365 days worth of decision, does 7 or 14 days seem very consequential in your mind? Probably not. I mean, when we look at it, the impact of tourism is like the proverbial holiday calorie in that it doesn't count. You know, you work out all year long, you cut down on drinking, you feed yourself right, you go running, you sleep right, all for that beach body. You go on holiday, you go down to Mexico for a couple of weeks, and it all goes out the window, right? Margaritas all around, you got guacamole going, but it doesn't really matter. So it's kind of like you work really hard all year round, making really good decisions, and then when it comes to holidays, it all goes out the window. And the same can be said on the impact of environment, impact on community, culture. They don't count. But the reality of the fact is that they do. So we're going to look at basically this impact of tourism, primarily starting with what we can see right now. Starting with carbon. Now, when we talk about carbon and the travel and tourism industry, people think that this is the largest impact that the industry has. If you talk to any old hotelier, right, so somebody that's been in the industry for a very long time, they'll tell you that this is the largest impact that the industry has. I once was working with a chief financial officer at Six Senses, for example, and I was just hired. And he's like, Amber, I didn't even know people like you existed. Like, what does sustainability have to do with this? He actually told me that they don't have any control over sustainability because all the impact was in travel, and they had no control over how people reached their destinations. And while that footprint is large, it's not to negate the impact that accommodations and tour operators, et cetera, do have within the industry as well too. So you see this sort of outdated model and thinking within the tourism industry right now in terms of where impact areas are. Now, as one example, we're going to talk a little bit about energy. I can't tell you what the aggregate energy consumption of the industry is because there is no aggregate. And it's important to note that this is a common theme when you start to look at the different metrics for sustainability in this industry. So, when we talk about energy, we do know that in a typical 300-room hotel, 45% of the energy is on HVAC and lighting. Now, energy cost then comes down to $2,196 per guest room per year in the US. And that's pretty significant. So I would go to my chief financial officer and I would point this out and he'd be like, Amber, this is just a cost of doing business, right? Because you got to remember, a lot of these hotel chains, they're operators. They don't own these buildings that they're operating in. So you have the split incentive with regarding sustainability and the operations of hotel accommodations. So if this is just the cost of doing business, there's no incentive to do better. So what they're missing here is that the reducing this energy by just 10% has the same bottom line impact as boosting the average room rate by $1.35 a night. And right now, the current mentality in this industry is that profitability actually comes just from two things: heads and beds and increasing room rate, and that's it. That is an outdated version that's missing so many opportunities in this industry, but it is one that is very prevalent. I also need to note here that this, like I said, it is an example from a 300-room hotel. Now, it's important to note that the numbers that we do have really come from the larger hotel chains, like the Marriotts, the Hiltons, the Intercontinental Hotel Groups, those that have thousands of rooms under their portfolio. What we don't have is the type of lodgings and accommodations that we have in Door County when we have the smaller individually owned hotels, because those actually create a larger share of the hospitality and tourism industry globally. So the numbers that we do have and that I am sharing are just a very small fraction of a much larger picture. Now, in terms of water, obviously we are a water summit, but hotels are actually very water intensive. If you're looking at a typical hotel room, a standard hotel room with about 3 to 4 fixtures, shower, 2 faucets, and a toilet, it's about 1,500 liters of water a day. But if you're staying at a place like the Four Seasons or the Aman, a very high luxury accommodation, you'll have upwards of 7 plumbing fixtures in one room alone, and it can be upwards of 3,000 liters per day per person. And in many locations around the world, this exceeds what local populations are using 10 times. So you start to understand the impact that tourism can have in these smaller destinations and remote destinations around the world. And while there's obvious risks associated with the fact of water shortages, I would have to say that the largest risk for the industry is really predicated on the fact that we are so dependent upon the water as a source of recreation, which attracts tourists. And this can definitely be said for Door County as well. We all know that we have about 300 miles of shoreline, and that is why people come to kayak, to boat, to kite surf, to scuba dive, to snorkel, to fish, whatever it is. A lot of our industry is really predicated on this amazing Great Lake that we call home. Now, outside of the United States, just to give an example of how tourism can affect local communities, this is a picture of Bali, or I should say a map of Bali, it's not a picture. But as you can start to see in some of these areas, that because there's so many hotels, there's so many tourists that come to this really beautiful and unique destination, it is depleting the local aquifers at a rate that is faster than its own ability to replenish itself. What happens in these situations is that should these aquifers become depleted, they collapse. And when an aquifer collapses, it can never be replenished. So even though this great island does definitely go through a rainy season where it gets more rain than it can handle at times, none of those aquifers are reabsorbing any of that water. So they're losing this precious fresh drinking water. And on top of that, because of the porosity, like we have dolomite or limestone, etc., because of that porosity, we have a lot of saltwater intrusion is also coming into the aquifer. So it's making that aquifer's water more saline and undrinkable. So literally, tourism is totally decimating some really precious areas around the world that people travel to. A lot of cities are really at risk, and some extremely at risk, such as Bali, and then we also have Mumbai in India. On top of water, we have a solid waste and a food waste problem. With regards to solid waste, hotel rooms generate anywhere between 1 to 4 kilograms of waste per day, per guest room. And I should say that this is actually similar to what you probably create at home. I mean, that's typically average. But what isn't average is the amount of food waste that is created by this industry, because it's massive. I mean, we all know the buffets. We all know what it means to have those opulent Sunday brunches, etc. And you may say, well, Amber, that's okay, right? It's biodegradable, it's food. But what you're missing is the water for processing, the energy for growing, the packaging, the transport, all of these different things that you're literally just throwing away. And it includes about, disposing of food that's never eaten. 218 billion is spent on growing, processing, transporting, and disposing of food that's never even used. So talk about waste. And then, just in those areas that we do have some numbers on, it's important to understand, well, first of all, it's not sustainable. But according to the UNEP, which is the United Nations Environmental Program, they have estimated that by 2050, if none of these practices changes, that we're going to see an energy consumption increase of 154%. On top of that, greenhouse gas increases 131%, water consumption increase 152%, and solid waste of 251%, which is incredible when you think about that this is basically holiday time. It's you on vacation. And these are only estimates. As I said, we don't have the whole picture, and the metrics that we do have don't tell the complete picture either. So, we don't, as an industry, we only have a partial view of our impact, and unlike other industries, our impact goes beyond just energy, carbon, water, and waste. So what we don't see is there's actually a lot. There's this great report that's out. The woman named Megan Epler-Wood, she is a lecturer at Cornell, she's a lecturer at Harvard University, and it's called Destinations at Risk, the Invisible Burden of Tourism. So it goes into a lot more detail than what I'm going to talk about. We're starting to get a little bit of accountability in airports and transportation and things like non-renewable energy, but a lot of things we don't even capture, such as the maintenance of the natural ecosystem, renewable water sources, wastewater management, sociocultural restoration, sociocultural issues, and on and on. So there's a lot of things that we don't account for. There is an inherent danger in underrepresenting or not representing the costs of tourism growth at the destination level to ensure they correspond with revenues from tax. It is therefore vital to understand the costs and benefits per tourist and the marginal cost as visitors' numbers grow. And I bring this up primarily because, our tax dollars do go to, visitor bureaus and things like that. However, these visitor bureaus, like around the world, are really regulated on how they can spend that money. So the money is spent basically on marketing and getting the word out and getting more people to destinations. And they do a really great job of it. But because of the policies and requirements around how our tax dollars are spent in this industry, there is no larger management approach to make sure that we're managing these different destinations for years to come. So just as an example, there are costs to destinations. So when you have more tourists than you have actual residents, there can be costs associated with infrastructure upgrades or an increased reliance on non-renewable resources. In terms of water, there would be things like cost of infrastructure upgrades, desalination plants, obviously not in Door County, but when you think about tourism, it's really located in near all water sources around the world, like some of the best destinations. If you're going down to Mexico, if you're going to Southeast Asia, if you're going to the Maldives, it's all on the ocean. So they don't all have aquifers, so it requires desalination. And then, like I said, over-exploitation of that resource where it depletes it for the local residents. Solid waste, it's not only dirty and messy and creates a problem, it's also very unhygienic because they don't have proper disposal. In areas, same with sewage as well too. I have seen sewage pipes literally on the most gorgeous destinations you could imagine, just like straight into the ocean and not that far into the ocean either. It actually became part of the beach. So it becomes very dirty and very toxic because there was no destination management. And then there's actually natural capital, so cost to maintain biodiversity or to replenish it if there was a loss of biodiversity is rarely accounted for, as well as social capital. So it's great when you go to these remote destinations. Some of the places that I've worked in this luxury business is really remote, where people are earning like $1 a day, on average, and you bring in hotel rooms that charge $1,200 a night. There's a big disconnect there between scales of living. So it changes the cost of living for locals, as well as amenities for residents who are displaced by tourism, and undermines community values. So those are some of the destination impacts. In addition to that, this industry has to deal with issues such as human welfare. And it is, again, this isn't primarily Door County, obviously, but where there is an exploitation of poverty, or there is an exploitation of local wages, where $5 a day is acceptable. So there is that issue, and also not talked about is this idea, or not this idea, but this huge problem of sex tourism as well too, and underage tourism in that regard. So human welfare is a big problem that's not really talked about. Animal welfare is another one. We do talk about circuses, or you have seen a lot of aquariums that have been closing down around the world. Have any of you seen the recent article out there that Germany actually has its first holographic circus? So they've actually replaced all living animals with these beautiful holograms. It's a really spectacular sight to be seen. So there's a lot of creativity that is coming around this. But inadvertently, this also happens. Like, this is a picture from off the coast of China at one of their popular tourist destinations. And what happened is this baby dolphin actually swam into the warmer waters. It's a baby. And people started picking it up to take selfies with it. And it kept happening to the point where they accidentally killed that dolphin. It was inadvertent, but all for the case of a selfie. But you see this everywhere. I've seen it where tiger owners will sedate their tigers for 24 hours a day just so you can take a picture with it. But these are conscious decisions that that travelers can make to not participate in this. Culture and traditions is another one. Now, a lot of culture and traditions are sometimes watered down to make them more palatable for visitors. So if any of you have been to Hong Kong Buffet in Sturgeon Bay, I can tell you that crab rangoons and kung pao chicken are not native to Cantonese cuisine, but they're still delicious. So that's great, enjoy it. But what I'm saying is that when you go to some of these destinations and the traditions are watered down, it waters down the tradition. So you have this loss of cultural heritage. It happens with traditions, but also sometimes with really sacred sites as well. And then, of course, wildlife and biodiversity loss is another one. And I am all for engaging and understanding wildlife and biodiversity better. I think that a lot of safaris can really open people's eyes and educate them about the issues of wildlife. But when wildlife becomes so inured to it, they change their they change their habits in feeding, in reproducing, etc. The closest thing we probably have in Door County to that would be seagulls and their dependence on you to feed them at the beaches, but that's about it. But this is a much larger problem in other destinations. And this is the last one, is over-tourism. And this is a really big one. And it's become so big in the last couple of years that it was actually shortlisted by Oxford's dictionary as word of the year last year. So over-tourism is, as it says, where there's more tourists than there are actual residents. This is a picture from the Louvre in Paris. I think it's in front of the Mona Lisa, if you've ever been there. I have been there, but not when it's been like 20 years since I've been there. But this is what it looks like. Today, there are more visitors in Paris each and every day than there are actual residents. So what this happens is actually that it alienates local residents, it degrades the tourist experience, it overloads the infrastructure, damage to nature, and it also, like I said, has that threat to local culture and heritage. So this is fast becoming an ever-increasing problem, and probably one of the reasons why you see topics of sustainable tourism come in the news a little bit more each and every day, because it impacts so many people. So as I said, there is a lot of impacts in tourism and hospitality. But despite those challenges, it's a growing industry. And it's really impressive to see that 3.3% annual increase up to 2030. That's great for everybody that works in tourist destinations. It's steady growth, and that's positive. But how do we preserve, conserve, and restore our environment and communities and culture while supporting economic growth at the same time? And that leads us to sustainability, obviously. Now, there's a lot of different definitions of sustainability. I think you've probably heard the Brundtland Report definition. There's just so many different ways to describe what sustainability is, and it can be really intimidating to a lot of people as well too. My poor father can't even pronounce sustainability in totality. He stumbles a little bit. But essentially what sustainability is, and how I like to describe it, is balance. And balance of what I call the 3 Ps, of planet, people, and profit. So when these 3 aspects are in balance, this is known as being sustainable. So as an example, to have a super financially successful hotel at the expense of underpaying your employees and exploiting local resources, that's not sustainable. But nor is having a super sustainable off-the-grid hotel but no guests. That's not sustainable either. So there has to be a balance between these 3 aspects. And essentially the aim of this is to ensure that tourism destinations are viable and accessible for generations to come. It's about leaving a legacy, which I often talk about. And this is not to be confused with ecotourism, because you hear that a lot, sustainable tourism, ecotourism, and people sometimes interchange the two. But ecotourism is actually more focused on areas that are already threatened and seeks to bring people to these areas in an effort to conserve them. By contrast, sustainability and sustainable tourism is for any type of tourism and any type of level. You can be like a Holiday Inn to a Four Seasons. You can be New York City to Ellison Bay, Wisconsin. It applies to all different types of tourism and tourism activities. And it's an ever-growing movement which seeks to align consumers who recognize the impacts of their decisions. So, it's pretty amazing. When I graduated university, sustainability was not even a topic. There was no programs in sustainable management or masters in sustainability or anything like that. I literally grew up in sustainability as I worked my way through my career. That's how new this is, so just in the last 15 years. And this is because there is an ever-growing demand from people around the world they recognize these larger global problems and want to be part of the solutions. And as a response, it's very market-driven, and you're starting to see corporations and governments follow suit. So tourism, as we said, is a mega huge industry which underestimates the impact that it has, both in terms of negative impacts, but also the potential to have positive impact. And I think that this is a huge opportunity that is really being missed out, because obviously, preserving the natural and cultural heritage is important, empowering local communities, generating partnerships, fostering international relations, and harnessing tourism's positive contribution to sustainable development and mitigate the industry's negative impacts by bringing together the many stakeholders. And I think that's what makes this industry so unique too, because tourism isn't like a construction industry where you have a constructor, you have a plumber, you have an electrician, you know who the stakeholders are. When it comes to this industry, we're talking about local governments, we're talking about visitor bureaus, we're talking about locals that live there, and we're talking about local businesses. There are so many aspects and so many people that need to come together to make this industry a sustainable one. But I do have hope because, as I said, in the last 15 years alone, I've continued to grow in this. And when I did start to find my passion for sustainability, I was in Boston, and my boss was literally telling me, he's like, you're not really going to do anything with this, just so you know, it's great that you want to be that sustainable champion, da 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 da. And come to find 15 years later that there's whole management programs around it, that it is an important component of the world that we live in. And this is because it's moving from this sort of philanthropical angle, throwing money at charities or, just preservation groups, to being the only thing to do and for everybody. As I said, there is this increased consumer demand out there. And in the world of tourism and hospitality, 52% of global travelers say they now alter their behaviors to be more sustainable while traveling. So they do things like walk, bike, or hike whenever they can. 68% would actually like the money they spend on travel to go back to the local community. They want to know that their impact is having a real and meaningful impact on the people that live in the communities that they go to visit. And a whopping 72% of global travelers are actually seeking authentic experiences that are representative of the local culture, which I think is great, that people are becoming more and more aware of where their money goes, to be that conscious consumer, not just in your daily lives, but even when you do go on holiday. And looking ahead, 73% intend to stay in a sustainable accommodation, which is actually up from 62% in 2016. Continues to increase. A whopping 62% would also feels better about staying in that type of accommodation, an accommodation that has an eco label. And just a note here about sustainable labeling is that it is important and also something missing from the industry. A sustainable label essentially puts the power in the consumer's hand to choose according to their own value system, so that you can look at a hotel and be like, all right, the Landmark does X, Y, and Z, and you can compare that across different hotel chains. So the Landmark to the White Gull or whatever, so that you can make your decision if the rooms are comparable stay and you want to stay in a sustainable location, that kind of makes a decision for you. So increasing that transparency, there's a huge call for that. 70% of global travelers say they would be more likely to book an accommodation knowing it was eco-friendly, whether they were looking for a sustainable stay or not. So that's interesting because back when this all started, if you were traveling sustainably, you were probably known as like a hippie or a tree hugger or some sort of very niche and narrow market of people that were interested in this. And now it's just becoming so mainstream that you want to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. And then 37% continue to call for an international standard for identifying eco-friendly accommodations. And this also is an increase. Last year it was only at 32%, but the problem with what we do have in industry for looking at eco labels across tour operators or hotels is there's a lot of them and they're not all equal. So if you look at the Travel Wisconsin one that we do have, it's not comparable to one that you may have if you're looking at Thailand and want to stay in a sustainable accommodation. So, eco labels are great in that they help the consumers make decisions, but only if the consumers understand what's behind that label. Otherwise, it's really difficult to cross-compare. Some are very greenwashy, I should say. They're nothing more than a scheme to put a stamp on your hotel by paying money. Really robust and really demand a high level of transparency and performance. So if you are interested in this, there's a lot out there, and definitely do your homework. And finally, 72% of travelers believe that people need to act now and make sustainable travel choices to save the planet for future generations. And I think that is a really strong sentiment. I have never seen a number that high of a population of travelers that want to do a good thing whenever they travel. So in that, I do feel that because there is such a consumer demand for this, that it really does start to drive the focus of different destinations, hotels, and tour operators to do better things. Because I don't see it happening the other way around, unfortunately. I don't see this industry taking the leadership stance that I believe that it needs to take given the size of it. I see a lot of lagging behind. I see a lot like putting their hands up in the air and still talking about the fact that airplanes have a lot of carbon footprint. You know, that really just diverts people's attention away from the impact that this industry does have. So it is interesting to see that, you know, you have a more conscious group of travelers coming into the fore. And, you know, I think destinations around the world and Door County as well should really embrace this, not as a negative thing, but as a unique opportunity to really highlight all the things that we do well. So the opportunity is clear. As people continue to integrate sustainability into their lifestyle, there are many opportunities for hotels, resorts, tour operators, and destinations in general to infuse sustainability into their operations and offerings and capture spending by travelers. I think it's great economically, and you know, as demonstrated, there is an escalation of consumer adoption and understanding of sustainability as a holistic and dominant lifestyle now and into the future. So I truly believe that for any tourism destination to be successful moving forward, granted there will be more travelers, but to grasp that attention by the future traveler is really to talk about sustainability, to talk about, you know, how we're doing as a community, to talk about our local experiences and talk about, you know, our footprint in all aspects, because that will determine a travel destination's growth path and success in the future. But more importantly, the call to action is now. It is time for tourism and hospitality to stand up and take responsibility as the impactful industry that it is, and to chart a new course in a real and authentic and meaningful way, and that a way that has the power to transform the world as we know it around us to one that is worth leaving for future generations. That's it. Thank you.